Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I think we'll go ahead and get started so we can keep things rolling. I am thankful for everybody to be back. We still have a bunch of participants. We've had some people already inquire about the recording. I'm just letting you know that we will make it available as soon as we can, probably next week sometime. All right, well then I'm going to introduce our first moderator for the afternoon is Kaylee Cusack. She is a communication specialist at Minn Kota Power Cooperative. She has experience in print, online, and television media. Kaylee is extensively involved in her community, including as a member of Valley Marcom, the Greater Grand Forks Young Professionals, Friends of Grand Forks Public Library, and the United Way. Thank you, Kaylee.
Thank you so much, Sadie, for inviting me to be a part of the conference. I was very excited to get that invitation. I'm especially excited to introduce our next session on the agenda, Photography on the Go, as you can see by the slide. Good photography is one of those skills that all communicators know they need to have somewhat of a grasp on, but really nailing it is sometimes a little bit difficult if you don't have some guidance along the way. And that's why I'm excited that we have a pro joining us today. I want to introduce you to Kari Sudell, a digital media specialist and staff photographer at the Energy and Environmental Research Center, where she develops and produces marketing, graphical, and technical materials. Kari provides photography and video services for EERC events, research projects, marketing materials, social media, and the web. And she also oversees the EERC website and internal web communications, kind of a master of all trades, if you will. Thanks so much for joining us today, Kari, and for agreeing to answer some questions at the end if time allows. So with that, I'll turn the stage over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kaylee. This is really exciting, and as she said, everybody has some experience with photography, but hopefully this will give you some tips to make it a little bit better. As she said, I'm a digital media specialist with the Energy and Environmental Research Center, and I'm also our staff photographer. So a little bit about my backstory. I have a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Drawing and Photography from UND. And post-college, I worked for a few different professional photographers, and I realized very quickly that I do not want to photograph kids and families all day. It is not my thing. Good for the people who do, but it's not my jam. So I kind of stumbled into graphic design and eventually wound my way to the EERC. For those who are not familiar, the EERC is a research entity that's working to develop solutions to energy and environmental challenges. And so for me, as a non-science person, I have a lot of experience photographing unusual things or working in less than ideal circumstances. And I work a lot with people who don't want to be photographed. I once had a chemist who told me, this is not a Hollywood set, this is a working lab. And so that's the kind of pushback that I get a lot. Being able to grow that aspect of my job has been challenging, but to me, that's really what makes it a lot of fun. So first off, while I use a very expensive camera, you don't need a fancy camera to get really great photos. Most of us have our cell phone on us all the time, and technology has really made for a great camera on most phones. This particular photo was taken near Center, North Dakota on a balmy 30 below morning. This is actually Minn Kota's Milton Young plant, and this was taken by an engineer on his cell phone. I just think this is a stunning shot. We have used it. We actually have a print of this in the hallway at the EERC, and I just love it. It's also the type of photo that I'm not going to get because I'm not getting up that early. So for me, it's really important to coach the STEM types that I work with into looking at things in a much more artistic way. I am not always out on the job site. I'm rarely out on the job site. And we use photos for all sorts of social, web, reports, presentations, and it's really important to have attractive photos of this technology. This was taken by a different engineer just this past summer on his cell phone, and I think that this really illustrates the importance of being in the right place at the right time. I just think this is a beautiful photo, and I'm pretty sure this is Minn Kota's as well. This might be the Project Tundra, which is pretty awesome. So every phone is different. I'm not going to get into all of the technical aspects of it. I really recommend that you do some research online and really test out your phone so that you're comfortable with the different settings you have. One thing that I request is that first thing first, make sure you are photographing on the highest resolution JPEG possible. You would not believe the number of people that I tell to do this and they check and they're on like some low resolution space saver JPEG. That's not okay. Also, and this sounds obvious, but clean your lens, because a dirty lens will leave smudges or blurs on your photo, and that's just not helpful. On your camera, phone, or on your camera, you should be able to set your focus. And for my phone operates a lot like this one here, where I tap the screen and a box or a circle will indicate the focus point. So if I wanted to focus on the tree behind this girl, I would just tap the tree and my camera would focus there. You should also be able to adjust the exposure if you want, and that's that slider bar right next to the circle. Your camera is making an evaluation for the correct exposure, but if it's underexposed or overexposed, you should be able to adjust that a little. On my camera, I always have it set to auto or smart HDR, which is high dynamic range. And that captures the really bright or really dark details so that they don't blow out. Where this is helpful is if you find something that's been overexposed or the dark gets really muddy, it's hard to bring that back in a photo processing thing if the information isn't there. And so the HDR really helps kind of make the range better. Also, I love tracking autofocus. It helps keep your camera focused on the subject even when they're moving. We've all seen photos done with portrait mode. That's where there's like the fake blur in the background. I love this, but be really careful because anything that's overdone on it just instantly looks fake. But a little portrait blur is a wonderful way to really bring attention to your subject. And one of my favorite things to use is burst mode for action shots. And that's where it just takes a whole bunch of photos in a quick succession. And I used it in this instance here. I saw a big wave coming in. I wanted to get it. And I was able to just pick the one image that I liked that really summed up the day the best. So photography is described as painting with light, and I really love that expression. Your camera evaluates the available light and it changes 3 elements to create the best possible image with the light available. It's really important for you to understand these elements, even if you're in a situation where you can't change them. So in no particular order, the first one we'll do is aperture, which is also known as f-stop. And that controls how much light enters the camera. The aperture can change in size and it works like the pupil in your eye. So if it's a bright scene, your pupil constricts, and in low light, your pupil gets a lot larger, letting in as much light as possible. The same goes for your camera's aperture. This really affects what's known as depth of field, which is how much of a scene is in focus. So you can see on the left, there's a real shallow focus. It's mostly just on the leaves, and the rest of the building just drops off. Whereas on the right, I'm shooting at f13. Any of those high numbers let in very little light, but they have a very long depth of field. So everything's in focus. I like to remember low light, low aperture, low depth of field, high light, high aperture, high depth of field. So this low f-stop can really make things in the foreground or the background drop out of focus. And this can be a really cool element that drives interest. I personally shoot with a low f-stop almost all the time. However, you have to be aware of, you might lose important elements in the begin or in the foreground or in the background. A good example is you would not want to shoot with a low f-stop if you were doing a group photo, because then only a certain layer of people would be in focus and everybody else would drop out. So next is ISO, and this goes back to the days of film. It refers to how sensitive film is to light. So at its simplest level, a camera is a box with a hole in it. And when light passes through the hole, it shines on a light-sensitive sensor inside the box, and it absorbs the light and captures the image. So there's what's known as slow and fast and kind of everything in between. And ISO is considered a slow film, which means it takes a lot of light to make an impression. And since the film takes longer to absorb, it captures the detail more effectively. On the other hand, right here, I've got ISO 2500, which is very fast, which means very little light is needed. Slow, you're going to see smaller grains, which gives you a crisp, clear image, whereas a fast, you get larger grains, you get that visible noise. You can see it in that glow around the light, for example. Then we have shutter speed, and that's literally just the amount of time the shutter is open, which affects how much light is allowed onto the sensor. For me, this is the most important aspect to worry about, especially when I'm using a cell phone or I'm using a camera that's set on auto mode. Faster is used for bright light or for freezing motion, and slower is for low light or increased blur. So on here, these two photos were taken within minutes of each other in the same lighting and weather conditions, but just by changing my shutter speed, I was able to kind of freeze the snow a little bit on the left side, whereas on the right side, it was zooming by so fast, you just hardly even notice it. Generally speaking, 1/80th or above, so 1/80th of a second or faster, is needed to avoid blur from holding the camera. We've all taken a night photo and had it turn out blurry. That's a slow shutter speed, and part of it means your hand or your body is shaking a little bit. So that's kind of the key to remember with dark conditions. They will slow the shutter speed and create an opportunity for camera shake or motion blur. I really recommend grabbing a tripod or investing in a mount that can keep your camera still in those low light situations. If you are really hard up and you know that you want to take a photo, but you don't have that, I always call it brace and breathe, where I brace myself. In this instance, I was braced on a picnic table, and you take a breath in and a breath out, and you shoot when you don't have any air in your body. And that's kind of your most still moment. It's not ideal, but it'll work. So these are just the three aspects of what's going on in your camera. You might not have any control, just something so that you're aware of it. So just a few rules that I always tell the research staff is get the photo. Better done than perfect. If you spend time setting something up and then that moment is gone, you can't use it, right? A perfect example of this is a coworker and I had been discussing photography tips, and a couple months later, he shows up at their family farm, and the sun is going down, and it's just got this glorious glow on their barn and on the trees. And his instinct was to go park and come back and like set this up nicely. But he thought, nope. And he hopped out of his car and got a couple shots of the barn, turned around, got a couple shots of the sunset. And a minute later, the sun had dropped down. It wasn't shining on the barn anymore, and the moment was gone. So if he had waited, he would have missed this. And I think it's just a beautiful shot. When you do have time, I like to tell people, just take a moment and think like an artist. We've all heard the rule of thirds. It's common because it works. It really helps drive some interest in there. If you are in a situation where the shot is really balanced, maybe centering it is the best bet for it. You don't have to rely on those rules. They're just there for an idea. I try to compose with images that will help draw the viewer's eye. So I always say, look for leading lines. This literally has lines that are leading up to this guy in the top of the lift. And I also really like to use negative space. So you can see this cloudless blue sky is acting like negative space here, and it just really draws your attention. So rule number 2, check your scene. This photo is a mess. There are drinks everywhere. There's like a garbage bag on the wall. This is not awesome. And I just think if you've got a few minutes, take a scan around and see what's going on in your photo that you could easily clear up. This is one of my favorites. It was taken by a coworker of mine, and he needed this CO2 pipeline, whatever, for a presentation. And he came back to the office and he was looking through his photos, and he saw in the background a Dr. Pepper bottle jammed into this, I don't know, pipe thing. And if he had noticed it in the field, he could have taken it out. It would have taken 30 seconds and shoot the photo again, but he didn't. And so instead he spent hours retouching this to get rid of that Dr. Pepper bottle. And these are just a couple funny ones that always make me laugh off the internet. Just check your background, see what's going on, step back and evaluate things. Sometimes your eye misses it in the moment, so just take a moment. Rule number 3, walk around, get a low angle, get high up above something. Your point of view can really affect how that photo turns out. So this is an example where I stepped out of the trailer and I loved what the sky was doing and everything, the lighting, and so I shot the photo. And then I walked around to the side and I saw it was better. It was a better angle. You've got the truck there, the wiry things are coming down a little bit cleaner. I got down a little lower, and I just think that the second photo on the right is a lot more successful than the first one on the left. So these ones on the left are a little bit messy. So all of these are trying to convey the same message, right? People evaluating data on a job site. And so on the left, there's just a lot going on in the background. You've got clipboards on the wall, a whiteboard, the exit sign. Your eye kind of goes all over, and it's just not a successful composition. So by changing my angle from the bottom left to the top right, I bring the focus right to Lonnie. It's not important what is on the screen. It's more about the feeling in the photo. You've got the hard hats and the Gumby suits in the background. It really tells a story. And then a little bit later, changing my angle again, you can see them, they're in discussion. There's monitors, the drill rig out the window, and it's, again, telling a story. These two here are the same exact piece of machinery. You've got people, you've got this trailer thing, you've got the truck, and the better angle just makes the one on the right more successful. In the left, you see the other truck that's coming in, you see a guy who's like kicking the dirt, this power pole in the background. And I understand that part of what makes the right more successful is the bright color, but that's what filters are for. You can live with that. And when possible, don't digitally zoom on your camera phone. Physically walk closer or just plan on cropping out the extra. You'll get a better quality photo from that. This doesn't necessarily apply to all photos, especially if you've got people in it, because you can get distortion with anything up close. But especially with something like this, where it's a landscape, they could have gotten closer and been much more successful. Take a look at the light and evaluate where the light is in comparison to you. We all know that light at high noon is not attractive to anyone. It's not attractive to anything. I always try to shoot mornings or late afternoons if possible. That's your best time. Where is the light in comparison to you? The light behind you will light up your subject, and the light behind your subject will darken it, which is totally fine if that's appropriate and that's what you're going for. Okay, rule number 4, people. These are roughly the same thing, right? They're core from a drill site, and they both have a really specific purpose. But in a presentation or a journal or on the internet, which is more interesting to look at? I have probably a dozen photos of the Badlands from this trip that I was on, and they're all beautiful, but this is my favorite because the people up there really add a sense of scale and give something interesting to look at. Every time I see this, I think of how big it is. You don't necessarily have to have people turn and look at the camera, especially in a setup like this one is, for example. If it's appropriate to the subject, that's totally fine. But in something like this, it's not necessary and it looks really forced. I always try to ask them to do something. I refer to this as people pointing at things, but that's not totally accurate because it's more people doing things. People are generally better at doing something than posing. It makes them more comfortable. So on the left, we've got Santa, and he's a researcher, and he's using a loupe to examine this coal. On the right, we've got an engineer, and he was being featured in publications. So we'd already done kind of that standard looking at the camera, and we decided to set up an action shot. And I just thought this one was so much more successful. Here I asked these guys to just grab a piece of core and point at the features. I'll always ask them to do something like turn a lever or flip a switch, or like the guy on the right is pretending to unscrew a pipe with his fingers. Obviously he can't do that, but for the photo, you don't know what's going on and it just looks really cool. Given the area that I'm working in, if I'm photographing the research or technology, it's typically these sorts of action shots. But sometimes the need arises for a professional look at the camera type business portrait. It should be as no surprise that geologists and engineers aren't really comfortable with posing. They don't know what to do with their hands. They don't know what to do with their body. And that tension can really come through in the photo. So I always recommend, first off, check on Pinterest or Google Images for some ideas. Look for poses based on the gender, based on the age group, based on the position that you are going to be photographing. So for example, you wouldn't pose a CEO in the same way that you posed a teenager. Most of my photography ends up being in the category of men in business suits. So I really rely on hands in pockets, not too far in. You want a nice relaxed elbow, maybe pop the thumb out or just hooked by the thumb. But it can be a really flattering look for a gentleman. Arms crossed is a really good one if it suits them. Some guys, it's not natural and it just looks forced. If that's the case, if I see that, I always make a move and try something different. I also rely a lot on leaning on things. It's just an attractive way, you know, find a wall, find a railing or a table or something like that. And then take a moment and step back and adjust their clothes. Pull the coat through the arm, or make sure there's no gaps in their shirt, check their ties, their collars. All of those things are much easier to fix in the moment than they are after the fact. Most of you won't be using your cell phone camera to do a business portrait of a person. I don't recommend that. But the same rules apply. I always have them turn their face towards me, and people have a tendency to turn up their head, raise their chin. And so 99% of the time I'll have them drop their chin slightly, but make sure they're not pulling it in or back, which can accentuate or make a double chin. It's got to stay nice and out and long. I check the details. What is her hair doing? Is her necklace centered? Fix their tie, etc. And then I'll have them roll their shoulders up and back so there's no hunching. Take a deep breath in and out, and that's usually enough to help them relax a little bit. If you have control, even lighting, like a flat lighting like you see here, will really hide things that a person might be more self-conscious about. So if they've got a crooked nose or crooked teeth, that can be really highlighted by angled lighting, but it's camouflaged by more flat lighting. then you, of course, like I was talking about earlier, take a step back. Your camera's lens, especially on a phone, will distort things that are up too close or at the edges. And we've all seen this if you take a selfie and you get like a forehead that's a mile long or your nose looks super big. It's that distortion. I only get really close up for things that it doesn't matter the distortion on. But for people, I always take a little bit of a step back. And if you have a better camera, put on a nice lens and shoot with that. And groups can be really intimidating for people. They were when I first started out. I always try to find a way to make layers. Have some people sitting, some people perched, some people standing. Men in general do not love to sit. So if you have a volunteer, that is super helpful. I always angle their legs so they're not straight onto the camera. And an easy rule of thumb for this is, as you can see with the gentleman in the middle, that one leg is pointing straight at the camera and then the other leg can go off to the side. And then you're just going to go through the same process. Give them all something to pose, something to do with their hands, check all the details, check the collars and the ties and what have you, and make sure that everything looks good before you get into shooting the photo. And in this age of digital media, I give you permission to overshoot at certain opportunities. I always think once in a lifetime events, or if there's people involved, especially somebody who's speaking and you are the only person who is possibly documenting this. People speaking in particular, you get really weird faces and closed eyes and that sort of a thing. So overshooting there is great. You do not have to overshoot at sunsets, flowers, general scenery, or any pictures of your dog or your kid or your spouse sleeping. Just a couple and you're good. So ultimately, you don't necessarily know what your photos will be used for. They might be in a publication, but you might also wind up with them on social media or in a presentation down the road. And so I always tell people, if you can take a moment and set the scene and then try to think artistically, you'll be really happy with your end results. So if there's any questions, I would be happy to help with that.
Thank you so much, Kari. We do have time for maybe a question or two. And
Okay.
One that did come in was, do you have a recommendation for the best way to clean your phone camera lens?
Absolutely. So it depends if you are in a situation where you know that you're going to be photographing. You can get the same type of stuff that you clean your glasses with, those little white, not scratchy ones. That's where I would go. I admit to being out and about and not having one of those on my hand. And then I will just find the softest, maybe it's like the sleeve of my sweater or something really soft that's not going to scratch it. Generally, my phone doesn't incur that much dirt compared to like my husband's phone is just constantly disgusting. So for me, I'm usually okay with just like a quick wipe, but I recommend the eyeglass cleaning ones.
Perfect. And we have just one more question that you might have an answer to. Do you have a favorite camera app you use that allows for more control over the camera settings compared to the stock camera?
That's a really good question. I admit to being equal parts a snob and super lazy. So if I'm going to be photographing something that I want a lot of control, I will use my nice camera. And that gives me all the manual control that I want. When I'm using my cell phone, 100% of the time, it's just on an auto mode, and I'll just go back in and fix some things later in Photoshop or whatever. I would be interested to know if anybody else has a good camera app, because that would probably be a great idea, but I don't have any recommendations because, like I said, I'm pretty lazy.
Not lazy, just you simplify.
Yeah, simplify. There you go.
Well, Kari, that's all the time that we have, but thank you so much for joining us. I know I
Thank
jotted
you.
down a ton of notes, so this was
Excellent.
very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.